Zeus, Apollo, Aphrodite, and Hera, Poseidon, Hestia, and Hades. These are the names of the Greek gods. Gods who in mythology adventured, loved, and lived thousands of stories worth telling. That's all they are now, stories. Besides some weird New Age folks, not a single follower remains who worships these gods. This wasn't always the case. There was a time, around 1 AD, when the Greek gods or some derivation of them were worshipped in a ring of land stretching from India to Britain. What happened? Why did this pantheon fall out of favor? The main reason is Christianity. Christianity and the revitalization of Persian culture in the East replaced the worship of the Greek gods to the level at which their worship no longer existed. This didn't have to happen. There was a point in history in which there was a very distinct possibility that the Greek gods would become the dominant ones in Europe, if not the world. In our timeline, the Emperor Constantine converted the Roman Empire to Christianity in the 330s. However, the pagans were not completely wiped out and were able to regain power under the Emperor Julian, later named the Apostate, in 355. Julian reinstated the persecution of Christians and made the worship of the old gods official again in the Roman Empire. However, he died fighting in Persia only 8 years into his reign. Christians regained power after him, thus undoing his work. This may sound like a historical blip, something of little long-term importance, but in reality this could have easily turned into a major turning point in history. Many historians believe that Julian the Apostate was planning on revitalizing the worship of the old gods under a new guise, and adapting the old ways of worship into the new world. He had allied the conservative forces of old Greek culture, and was trying to make a serious counteroffensive. If this is what Julian had intended, it makes this event immensely important, and to understand why I need to explain some religious theory. Throughout history there have been periods of change in which new religions replace the old, one of which is the Axial Age, or the period between roughly 600 BC and 600 AD, or the time between the prophet Elijah and Muhammad. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, take your pick of modern religions, came out of this time, and today Axial Age religions dominate the entire world. As it existed in our timeline, the worship of the Greek gods was a pre-Axial Age religion that couldn't compete against religions like Christianity or Islam. However, if it was revitalized in Axial Age form, the Greek gods would stand a chance of survival. This happened several times in our world. Exactly the same thing happens in India, in which the threat from Buddhism forced the priests of India to redesign the old Indian faiths into a central umbrella of Hinduism. The old gods were given an axial framework and survived. Another similar thing happened in Japan, where having to deal with Buddhism, the old Japanese traditional faiths were reworked into the religion of Shinto, standing alongside Buddhism to create a truly Japanese combination. In this timeline, a similar thing happens with the old Roman gods. I'm not sure how the ancient Greco-Roman faith could be altered to survive the Axial Age, but I have a couple ideas. The idea of the universal soul is incorporated, and the getting into the Elysian fields become possible for normal, good people. Maybe the sacrifice elements would be sidelined for personal daily sacrifice. This timeline starts with Julian the Apostate being able to survive the campaign and fight his way out of Persia back into Roman lines. Julian lives into old age, with him being able to revitalize old Greco-Roman culture. The reforms I suggested earlier happen, thus turning the old faith into an Axial Age religion. If we want to make the scenario even more plausible, Julian could found a successful dynasty, thus passing on the pagan tradition. This would not actually be out of character for this time period. There was an enormous revival of Greek culture in the final days of the Roman Empire. Greek philosophy, literature, and language all had an enormous revival in the eastern half of the empire, so why not religion as well? So what if Julian the Apostate had been able to revive the pagan traditions? What would borders be like today? What would culture be like? What would the world be like? That is the question of this alternate history. People often know about the division in the Roman Empire between the Latin-speaking western half of the empire centered from Rome and the Greek-speaking eastern half centered from Constantinople, but there was also a much more subtle division than that, the parts of the empire that thought and the parts of the empire that fought. Towards the end of the empire, the Roman Empire had a collection of interconnected metropolitan cities hugging the Mediterranean. These were cities like Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Carthage. These cities tended to speak Greek, and most of the empire's trade, tax revenue, philosophy, and culture came out of them. These cities tended to be very strongly rooted in traditional Greek and Roman culture. This part of the empire was the part that had Christians and wanted a Greek revival. There was the other part of the empire, though, the far provinces in modern-day France, the Balkans, the mountains of Turkey, and Spain. This is where the armies were raised, among barely civilized semi-tribal peoples. This part of the empire spoke Latin and used a simplified Roman culture to bridge the gaps between all the semi-tribal peoples. Since the Roman Empire towards the end was basically a military dictatorship, this side of the empire ran the empire and the emperorship, while the bureaucracy were staffed by city folk. This part of the empire tended to mix the old native gods with the Roman gods, but also followed Mithraism, a new religion from Persia, and worshipped Sol Invictus, or the Holy Sun. As you're probably starting to see, the revitalization of Greco-Roman culture would only really pass in the first of these two halves of the Roman Empire. The new religion would only really catch on in the red part of the empire you can see on this map. The new faith would be a complex mishmash of all the inconsistencies of hundreds of little gods, local variety, etc., a lot like Hinduism in our timeline. Like Hinduism and unlike Christianity, which has a simple message, thus making it easy to convert people outside of its original culture, the complexity of this would make it hard for people outside of the Greco-Roman part of the empire to convert, the part that was already familiar with Greek culture. The revitalized faith would be competing for the same part of the empire as where Christianity was most powerful. This would mean that if the new faith outcompeted Christianity, it would truly drive Christianity underground. However, the parts of the urbanized half of the empire that weren't Greek or Roman would be attracted to Christianity. Areas like Egypt and Syria, which had a small Greek ruling class but were majority native, would remain Christian, while their ruling elites would worship the revitalized Greek faith. Julian the Apostate was a pretty good soldier and seemed to be a half-decent emperor. Thus, having him survive into old age and possibly creating a stable dynasty might result in the Roman Empire not falling. However, I'm going to make the call to err on caution and say that the Roman Empire still falls apart. This is because most of the forces that led to the empire's collapse were already in motion, and there were other good soldier leaders that were unable to save the empire in our timeline. Having the northern half of the empire not fully on board with the worship of the Greek gods might create issues in the long run if the Roman Empire survived a while, but by this point the empire only had 100 years left. The part of the empire that wouldn't worship the Greek gods was almost entirely conquered by the Germanic tribes. This brings up a lot of very interesting possibilities. Without the Christianization of the empire, and with the Greek faith being restricted to the cities, Mithraism, the faith of the army and thus the Romanizing forces of the rural empire, would probably become dominant in much of Western Europe. I haven't talked a lot about Mithraism yet, but I included an insane amount of my alternate histories, and so my loyal fans are probably rolling their eyes now. Mithraism was an originally Persian religion that became very popular in the Roman Empire, especially in the army and the upper classes. It worshipped the sun god Mithras, and its holy symbol was the bull. Mithraism was very popular and could have easily become the dominant religion of the empire instead of Christianity. In this timeline, when the Germanic tribes enter the Roman Empire, they convert to Mithraism, thus making Western Europe Mithraic. Mithras and Odin, the main god in Germanic culture, are quite similar, both being warrior honor-based gods who value knowledge and manliness. One of the main symbols of Odin, the horse, is very similar to Mithras's bull. I would not find it unlikely if Odin and Mithras were grafted together to form possibly the most badass religion in all of history. The Germanic tribes would over time convert the tribes back at home, and Northern Europe would slowly become Mithraic. The peoples of Eastern Europe, like the Poles, Russians, and Hungarians, were probably converted to their religion, since they were converted by Germanic peoples in our timeline, and the Greek church would be harder to convert to than our timeline's Byzantine Christianity. Meanwhile, the Bulgars would convert to the Greek faith since they would have so much contact with the Greek Byzantine Empire, and since Bulgaria was enormous in this time period, it would turn most of the Balkans to the Greek faith. With Northern Europe mainly Mithraic and Southern mainly Greek worshipping, Europe would be very divided in this timeline. The idea of Europe in our timeline came out of the common Christian identity, and this would simply not exist in this timeline. This would likely prevent a single Western civilization from developing, with each side of Europe going off into different directions. In this timeline, Christianity would remain the religion of the majority in Syria and Egypt, thus meaning it would still exist to influence Muhammad, and so he would still found Islam, which takes a lot of inspiration from Christianity. The point of departure is only a couple hundred years earlier, and hasn't really affected Arabia yet, meaning the chances of Muhammad's birth are still pretty high in this timeline. This means that the Islamic invasions, the rise of Islam, etc. would still happen. Having North Africa and the Middle East turn Muslim would basically shrink the revitalized Greek faith to just the Balkans, Turkey, and Italy. Beyond this point, it becomes hard to predict exact events, since the timeline is deviated so much from ours. How successful would the Muslim invasions be? What would this timeline's Byzantine Empire be like? Would the Franks still rise to power? These are all questions that are very hard to answer. Religion and politics are definitely mixed, and changing one totally affects the other. But the relationship is so subtle, it makes it hard to predict. However, I can predict some long-term cultural trends from what each religion, each region would pick. France and parts of Spain would be very different in this timeline. In our timeline, the Catholic Church helped Romanize the peasants of these nations. Even very late into the empire, the peasantry of these nations spoke Celtic languages, and were mainly Celtic. The spread of Christianity helped spread Roman culture, and the Latin language through the backcountry of these nations. The ironic thing is, as the Roman Empire was politically collapsing, the culture of the Roman Empire was getting stronger. This would completely change the dynamic in this region. In our timeline, the Germanic tribes assimilated into the old Roman cultures because the entire native population followed them. This is why the French-speaking language descended from Latin, used Roman law, etc. In this timeline, only a small urban minority and upper-class landowners would speak Latin and indulge in Roman culture. As the Roman Empire fell and cities collapsed, this group would gain less and less power. This makes it much more unlikely that the Germanic tribes would assimilate into Roman culture. This is kind of what happens in Britain, where the Roman influence was weaker and the Roman culture did not survive the destruction of the Roman cities. This would make this part of the world Europe's Indonesia. Indonesia in our timeline is an absolute smorgasbord of cultures without any of them being dominant. Being settled by Malays, civilized by Indians, converted to Islam by Middle Easterners, and taking lots of influence from China. This means that the Indonesian identity is tenuous at best. Another example is the Arabic world. For hundreds of years, the Arab nations were controlled by foreign aristocrats and warriors. This weakened the region as a whole because the foreign aristocrats couldn't pull on the native population because their roots to the land were weak, and the native population didn't have the military power of the foreign aristocrats, so it just weakened the region as a whole. France would be similar to this in this timeline, with a Germanic ruling class, a Roman educated and urban class, and then Celtic peasants. Northern Europe in general would be ferociously sexist. People like talking about how sexist Christianity and Islam are, but Mithraism is a totally different category. Mithraism didn't even let women join the religion, and women were seen as spiritually less than males. At least in Christianity and Islam, men and women were theoretically equal, and have the same chances of making it to heaven as male. Northern Europe would likely be like some of the worst Islamic nations of our timeline, giving women absolutely no rights. This would likely make it hard for the region to industrialize and advance technologically, as the disenfranchisement of women creates issues with industrialization. This is because the seclusion of women creates issues in cities where most of the work is done outside the local farm or home. Also, being split off from Southern Europe would make Northern Europe slower to develop. In our timeline, the Mediterranean was Europe's connection to the rest of Eurasia and the cultures like Islam, China, and India. Southern Europe passed this and all the technologies and ideas that came with it to Northern Europe. Without this connection, Northern Europe would develop more slowly. Slavery would have likely never ended in Southern Europe. In our timeline, Christianity banned slavery of other Christians, thus destroying it in Europe over time. Besides China, Christian countries were the only ones that really abolished slavery of their own free will. In Mithraism, all men are considered equal beneath God, thus meaning it still might happen in the north. In Greek philosophy, however, and myth, slavery was encouraged. The philosophical view was that slaves were chosen at birth to do menial work, the only thing their minds could handle. This was encouraged because it allowed the upper classes to not do work, thus opening them up for politics and philosophy, thus allowing a perfect state. This meant that slavery was encouraged. Southern European civilization would likely be very socially conservative. Having a religious revival that regains cultural power tends to result in a very socially conservative and inflexible society, as the priest classes tend to dominate the revived system and their primary goals are the maintenance of the old social system. We saw this in India, where the Brahmin revival of the old gods against Buddhism resulted in a very religious and conservative caste-ridden society. The priests absolutely ran India for thousands of years, taking it in a very different direction from any other civilization. Another similar case is the Islamic world, where the traditional Islamic theologians gained total power of the intellectual dialogue, driving out the rationalists. This made Islamic society very conservative and set in its ways. This would mean that Southern Europe would have trouble modernizing and developing new ideas, with the society being partially run by a very conservative priest class. We never would have seen the Italian Renaissance, humanism, or similar philosophies coming out of Italy in this timeline. This would effectively intellectually stick this region in the ancient world, and would give it trouble industrializing and advancing. In general, Europe would be much weaker in this timeline, with the Muslims being more powerful. In our timeline, Northern Europe helped out Southern Europe more times than I can count, since they were both Christian. We saw this with the Poles saving Austria, the Germans, Normans, and French fighting in Italy, and the English in Portugal, and so forth. With Europe being divided, and the North not helping the South out, the Muslims would likely be much more successful in this timeline. In general, we never would have seen the rise of the West to world dominance. In our timeline, the rise of the West after around 1500 is very peculiar. In our timeline, every one of the major cultures of Eurasia, the West, Islam, India, and China, were doing really well around 1200. Then barbarian invasions, disease, war, and climate change brought most of them to a low point around 1400. The peculiar thing is that every major culture except the West turned in on itself and became very conservative. For reasons that have been argued countlessly, the West, however, kept moving developmentally and reinvented itself. The West had the fastest technological development by far in all of history, conquered most of the world, and imposed its culture everywhere. This is probably an aberration and not very common in history. With everything I've talked about, I simply can't see the West becoming dominant in this timeline for so many reasons. However, the harsh seas and islands of northern Europe are still amazing practice for boats, meaning Europe was hundreds of years ahead of the rest of the world in naval technology. This might mean that Europeans still might discover America, but they'd never be able to surpass the other main Eurasian civilizations like Islam and China. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, or support me on Patreon, and please stay tuned for my next video. Thank you.